Okay, well, what I'm going to talk to you about is perhaps slightly into what Paul was talking about, and hopefully we can draw out some of the differences in this. Now, I'm part of what's called Project ICAD, which is based at the University of Leeds. It's a European Research Council funded project. We're doing it for about 3 years, and what we're looking at is the production and use of climate information in the UK. So to give you an example of that, we've had a lot of climate projections. One of the things that's quite interesting about those projections is that people like ICAD would argue that the whole reason we've got these projections and we've quantified them and made them really probabilistic is because that's what users wanted. So we needed to do uncertainty. Well, actually, what does that actually mean? Well, to do uncertainty, we didn't have the modelling to do it at that time, so we broke the model up into lots of different ways, and that then had an effect on how it was reassembled and how it gets delivered to people. And as Paul was saying earlier, they wanted a simpler software interface. Actually, they need more than that. They need to actually understand what the hell's going on behind the process, and that is a certain amount of tailoring that isn't there at the moment. So what we're trying to do is pull these things together. And this is a small part of the project which we ran last year. And what we did was we did a survey of local authorities in Great Britain. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, we've had, the last few years, we've had the Climate Change Act, we've had new climate projections, the climate risk assessment came out last year. In September we'll hopefully get the National Adaptation Plan, and there's a whole set of things moving on. We've had ICAD moving to, its functions moving to the Environment Agency, so there's been a whole set of different things moving around this arena. And the idea being that there's a whole set of capacity building that's gone on, or at least has been attempted to go on. So what we did was we sent out a survey to these local authorities, and all we really wanted to do was find out a few things, which is, what's your awareness of this information out there? How do you use it and why do you use it? Which sources do you gravitate towards, and why do you gravitate towards those particular ones? Is it because you think they're more accurate? Do you think it's because they're more convenient? Is it because they come with a stamp of approval because they're done by the Met Office? What is it about that piece of information that's driving your need? And in turn, what is stopping you using this information, or stopping you when you use that information in particular situations? So really what we're trying to do is pull out these kind of interesting issues. And really what we did was we sent the survey out to environment, sustainability or climate change officers, especially if there are any climate change officers still existing in these local authorities. And we sent it out to all 407. We've got a pretty decent response rate, about 28.5%. And then I followed that up with 20 interviews from different government offices to see if there was any kind of regional difference in how these people were approaching and how they were doing their surveys. And one of the things you will find is that there is a great deal of difference. England really does fall behind when it's compared to people like Scotland and Wales. And that might sound surprising, but Scotland are far ahead in everything they're doing in this. And we really, as an English nation, need to actually pull up our socks on this. Now, the main drive behind this survey was to compare it to another survey that was done by Demerit, based here about 10 years ago. And what they were looking at was almost the same sort of questions, but at that point, climate change information and the landscape around it was still in its infancy, so it's still maturing. And what we're interested in is, well, all these things that have gone on in the last 10 years, has anything changed? And if it has changed, what is that change? Well, there's some good news to start off with, which is always good. We asked, local authorities, do they feel they have the information to actually do something? Now do they have the information to change a plan or a policy or whatnot? And a great overwhelming percentage of them said yes, they do. Yep, we can do it. We're not doing too bad. And this is quite interesting when you compare it back to the previous survey, which was effectively said that when it looked at kind of technical information like the climate change scenarios in 2002, 40% of people hadn't even heard of them. 12% of more of those people, so now we're up to 50%, weren't even sure they knew what they were. Now you compare this to our survey, which we asked them about the UK climate projections, and only 9% of people hadn't heard of them, which in some ways that's a big success. Now, I think one of the reasons we can attribute this to is the national indicators, the 188 indicator. Now, what's quite interesting about that indicator was if you look back in 2008 when it was introduced, less than half of the people who were surveyed on that half local authorities in Great Britain were actually at what would be considered getting started on climate adaptation. And the national indicator looks at 4 different levels. Level 1 is you're getting started. Level 2 is that you're starting to do an assessment. Level 3 is that you've done your assessment and you're implementing it. And what we found was, what the Climate Change Committee have also found, is that the number of organisations have moved, local authorities have moved through this process quite nicely until the indicator was abolished. Now, one of the things we wanted to find out about them was, what is the piece of climate information that you use most often when you're thinking about making decisions? So what seemed to come out was, I've broken this down to a smaller range because we asked a whole set of other things as well, not just these things. But what's quite interesting is the projections in the middle. So what we asked them is, do you use them? And they said, yes, we always use them, or we sometimes use them, overwhelmingly. And this is adding that up is about 90%. So 90% of them say we either use them all the time or we use them some of the time. So that seems quite positive. That's a positive thing because we spent a lot of money on these projections. We hope that they would actually help people making decisions which are uncertain. Well, we then asked them, how easy do you find these sources of information? And if you go back to projections again, what's quite interesting and slightly paradoxical is it's almost bang bang. Some people think it's really easy, some people think it's really difficult. That doesn't make any sense. Why would some people think it's really easy and some people think it's really difficult? There's something hidden in that. And that's what I'm going to come on to in a minute. So, why would
But also, out of everything, it's the one they consider the most difficult. Is that correct interpretation?
Yes, that is.
Yeah.
It is the one I also think is most difficult. I would argue that actually take that amount off and stick it onto that one. That's what I reckon that we're really looking at. So then we ask a very simple then question is, how reliable is the information sources you're using? Is there any kind of pattern here about, do you think this one's easy, so you use this one more often, and you think it's more reliable because of that, or is there some kind of mix between them? And what's interesting, what this is highlighting here, is these are all technical sources of information. So they're quite comprehensive, they're quite, they need a fair amount of skill and time and resources to actually get underneath and actually use these things. And of course, what we'd expected from the reliability side is that all of these rank incredibly high, such as projections. So that's not overly surprising. We wouldn't expect anything different, I guess. But then I think really what I wanted to take you back to the previous draft is then what does use mean? So when they say they're using projections, what is it that actually mean by that? And what we seem to find is, and if we sort of go back to that, is that 40% said yes, we always use them, and 38% said we sometimes use them. 49% said that they were easy to use, whereas 40% said no, they're difficult. So this is where I went back and did the interviews, and I'd asked them very simple questions. So, you say you use the projections, what do you mean by that? Actually, I just use the briefing report, I flick through, pick up some of the graphics, might take some of the text, and that's about as far as they'll go with it. Or, they'll do the opposite, which is they'll bring in a consultant who will then interpret the information for them, build up a risk framework, build up a whole set of decision-making tools, which they then use, and they assume that this tool is the projections. They're still using the projections, but they're using the tool instead. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's the whole process of trying to make these things tailored to what they wanted to do, but it's not one and the same. So, all of this kind of ties into saying, what I want to do is try and pull this all back. And what I want to try and say is that one of the things we try to kind of try and understand about this is, so you're in your local authority, you've got lots of pressures on you. What is your main concern here? And unsurprisingly, the main concern is the economic downturn. And that beats all kinds of things, from chemical spills to transport failures to terrorism and even weather extremes. That's the number one. We haven't got the money. And the reason why this is interesting is because what we've had is a whole set of structural things removed from these local authorities. So their budgets have been tightened, they've removed climate change officers, certain people are now wearing multiple hats, lots of people are now changing their job titles, adaptation's dropping out of that title altogether, or they're now talking purely in mitigation terms, which I think connects back with Paul. And what that's really concerning about is that if we assume that the people who were actually trying to implement the projections brought in consultants to do it for them, that costs money. And they no longer have that money to do that. So what they're having to do is they're having to do it in-house and skill up. But the problem is that the projections are incredibly difficult to use. So they're not skilling up in the way that they would like to, because they're having to either do multiple jobs, or they don't have the PhDs or bits and pieces that you'd need to actually use these efficiently. So one of the things that we wanted to find out from them was, so if you could ask anything from the central government, what is it you'd be? Well, unsurprisingly, they want more money, they want it ring fenced. What they really, really would like, and this goes back to what Paul was saying again about, they want a business case. And a business case is not so much they want it in economic costings. They want to be able to say to their line manager, you want to invest in adaptation because it will pay off over this period of time. The problem is that adaptation comes with a long-term connotation attached to it, and it doesn't sell very well. So what we started to find was that actually the words they would use change. They wouldn't use adaptation, they would use resilience, they would use preparedness, they would use all kinds of ideas about economic costings as a way to try and draw people in. But as soon as they did that, they're in a trap, because the mitigation side is far more obvious in terms of its cost savings, and they were then onto a hide into nothing, especially then when they brought in this kind of complex information and tried to explain it and realised that they didn't have the skills or infrastructure to actually implement any of it. So, and this is probably a tangential point to this, but what was really interesting under the previous government's administration was things like the Nottingham Declaration, which was a whole set of, it was a commitment by local authorities to sign up, and they were going to do certain adaptation measures. And I think it's so extraordinary, like 90% of local authorities in Great Britain signed up to it and actually tried to move through the process. Now that's gone, and it's been replaced by Climate Local. What's really interesting is so many people we spoke to have never heard of Climate Local. The ones who have heard of Climate Local will not sign up to it. And the reason they don't want to sign up to it is because they think if they commit to it, they then have to do something. And they have to explain it to everybody in their organisation who's going to say, well, you're going to put money behind this, you're going to have to prove this case, and they can't do it. Because of that, it seems weak, and they will not touch it. And sadly, this also connects in with Climate Ready. The visibility of Climate Ready is just not quite what it needs to be. And what's concerning is that we've now got rid of the national indicator. The national adaptation reporting powers do not cover local authorities, so local authorities are kind of left in this kind of limbo position about, well, how are you going to push them on to do adaptation work? And as Paul was saying, what they effectively do is they just see adaptation as flooding. So it just gets bounded around things they already have in motion.